My dissertation is titled Don't Tell Me Underground, The Politics of Joy and Melancholy in Jordan's Alternative Arabic Music. I wanted to start with thank yous. Thank you so much to my committee for supporting my project over the years. And my deepest thanks to each expert in alternative Arabic music who took the time to share their expertise with me for my research. Thank you to Fulbright and the UCSB Center for Middle East Studies for funding my research. And so many thanks to my wonderful family and friends, many of whom were kind enough to join us today. Issues addressed. One of the major issues that my dissertation addresses is that Arabs are too often misrepresented in English language media, reduced to mere victims or enactors of violence. Another major issue specific to academia is that Jordan is to date nearly absent from English language music scholarship. At this point, to my knowledge, I have yet to find a book, actually academic or otherwise, that focuses solely on the music of Jordan. We do have select individual academic articles, and there is one dissertation I found in English by a Jordanian musicologist named Hani El Khatib very recently that has focused on Jordan. But because of this gap, my work contributes to filling it. And it also aims to counter these misrepresentations of Arabs by providing a fuller spectrum than these limited tropes that are all too common. And to give you a brief idea just of the format of this presentation, I'll be sharing my findings throughout rather than waiting till the end, so it's easier to see the connections of how my different examples and evidence have supported my findings and answered my research questions. And what the structure of the presentation, I'll be giving you a summary of each element of the dissertation, starting with information from the broader introduction and moving forward from there to 3 body chapters that focus more narrowly on specific musicians. And then from there, I'll return to the examples from chapter 2 to give you a little more depth there. So my research location is Amman, Jordan, which should be visible in red here. Let's see, in case the screen is blocking it. Okay. And this location, it's in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's also known sometimes as the Levant, and it's bordered by Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the Israeli-occupied Palestinian territory of the West Bank. And the population of Jordan is approximately 10 million. Research questions. My dissertation asks, what is alternative Arabic music in Jordan? What role do affects or emotions experienced socially play? And what does being political mean in these music contexts? Research methods. So to answer these questions, I've conducted 3 different periods of ethnographic fieldwork in Jordan. First, over summers in 2016 and 2017, and for the full academic year from August 2018 to July 2019, in that case funded by Fulbright. And over the course of this period, as well as afterwards remotely, I've conducted more than 40 interviews, participated in more than 60 concerts as an audience member, and I volunteered at El Beled Theater, an institution that I'll give you some more background on next. I've worked to translate Arabic song lyrics in close collaboration with a range of native speakers, as well as wonderful Arabic instructors, such as my committee member, Dr. Reynolds. And I've finally worked to follow the lead of local experts in alternative Arabic music as much as possible in my analysis. So the whole kind of training that we receive in my field is not to treat ourselves as the ultimate experts, but instead it's really the opposite, that we have the opportunity to spend an extended period of time learning from local people who are always going to be the true experts in their own culture. And so rather than, for example, kind of arriving in Jordan and sort of already having my conclusions already decided, it's the opposite, to try to have an open mind to learn from others. And so to that end, I make a point in this presentation to give you direct quotes from different musicians and different scene contributors that have guided my own analysis. And also part of it that has happened more recently is once I had full drafts of chapters or the full manuscript, I worked to send my writing to different individuals I wrote about. So if they wanted to, they could read it. And luckily I did get some great feedback from them, some of which I'll share with you today. For a little more on Al Balad Theater, so this is an independent theater in the capital, in Amman, and it's also a deeply loved one. It's loved for hosting arts festivals, such as they have a storytelling festival every year, a street art festival, and every other year they have a music festival, which I volunteered at in 2017 and 2019. And that's where I took the photograph you'll see here, the Al Balad Music Festival. And this photograph is of a band I'll tell you more about for my second chapter. Their name is Ailul, which means September. And they're performing here in one of two adjacent ancient Roman amphitheaters in the heart of downtown. They also support local musicians. So Ailul is a great example of this, a band founded in Jordan that does not yet have global fame. But when Al Balad invited them to perform at their internationally known music festival, it was a great opportunity to increase their publicity. Bands such as Ailul have also received some funding from the theater as they were developing their first album, and different artists have received free access to rehearsal space at the theater. So it's a very loved institution that was also my institutional affiliation during my Fulbright research. A few key terms that I explain in my introduction include Palestinian indigeneity. This is relevant to my research because the majority of Jordan's population is of Palestinian descent. And in my work, I refer specifically to individuals of Palestinian descent as indigenous, following here anthropologist Patrick Wolf, as well as a broader consensus in Palestine studies, where Palestinians are defined as indigenous in relation to Israeli settler colonialism. Now, to clarify here, this does not imply that all Palestinians individually identify as indigenous, but the point here is that it's a relational understanding Palestinians as indigenous in relation to Israeli settler colonialism. And in case this isn't a term that you've heard lots before, the idea is that settler colonialism aims to control the land where settlers have arrived. And unfortunately, this often involves working to erase the individual inhabitants who were there previously. And likewise, another key term I explain in my introduction is Israel. Israel refers in my work specifically to the actions of the nation state. It does not imply that, it does not refer to all Jews or that all Jews agree with the Israeli nation state. And I personally found out as an adult that I'm of part Jewish ancestry, which only increased my sympathy for the refugee experience. But especially given recent incidents of rocket fire exchange between Israel and Gaza, I wanted to clarify that Israel and Palestine are not equal geopolitical actors. However, like I said, part of the problem is that in English language media contexts, there's a bias where we are much more likely to get a perspective in favor of the Israeli nation state. And so my work makes a contribution by specifically centering Indigenous Palestinian and other Arab perspectives, giving us a voice that is needed and less heard in our contexts. And to briefly provide one recent experience of an Indigenous Palestinian, on May 13th of this year in Haifa, Israeli forces arrested Wallace Abate of 47 Soul, a band that I focus on in my second chapter that you'll get to hear more about from me. And he was arrested for streaming on Instagram or broadcasting Israeli far-right attacks on his Haifa neighborhood. But thankfully, he was released the following day on house arrest. My central claim in this dissertation is that alternative Arabic music is a powerful mode for expressing and elevating the voices of everyday, often marginalized people in and around Jordan. This music enables participants to express that their challenges have not defeated them. It shares a fuller spectrum of identity than suffering or victimhood. And it highlights musicians' agency by emphasizing that they actively choose to perform in ways that represent themselves and others complexly. And as I mentioned, like I'll be sharing my findings throughout the presentation. And so to answer my first research question, most basically, what is alternative Arabic music? It refers to Middle East and North African interpretations of global genres such as rock, rap, electronic music or electronic dance music, and metal. And these genres in the region most often receive minimal support from major music industries. And they often get defined in opposition to mainstream pan-Arab pop music, which if you're not familiar, you could loosely compare it to top 40 pop music in the US. So in opposition to that kind of mainstream industry-supported pop music. To get more specific about Jordan's place in alternative Arabic music, my research shows that for a country with many challenges, Jordan holds an outsized space in the region's alternative Arabic music. Some of these challenges include a very high cost of living. The Economist last year, for example, ranked it the second highest cost of living in the region. High unemployment, according to the World Bank, the second quarter of 2020 had 23% unemployment in Jordan, as well as high import expenses. One of the people I interviewed, a sound engineer and founder of a country cover band called Pinewood Rift, Sari Abu Adel, shared with me that in customs in Jordan, a guitar is in the same category as diamonds. He also shared that he imported a PA system for his work and had to pay an additional 92% of the original cost in customs and fees. Also, Jordan has among the lowest rates in the world of women working outside the home, which could in part explain the male bias in the musicians that I was able to speak with. Though luckily in my conclusion, I'll be able to share with you some recent developments that have shifted the gender representation. My first chapter focuses specifically on the band Mashru'a Layla, which means night project or Layla's project. However, the band specifically leaves it ambiguous exactly how to translate their name. And I also discuss performances of melancholy by this band. And they're Lebanese, so to clarify, not all bands that perform alternative Arabic music in Jordan are from Jordan or Jordanian. They're bands that tour from all over the world and the region there, of course. And Mashru'a Layla felt specifically relevant to me because just as I began my research on this music in this place, the band reached international headlines when their scheduled concert in Jordan in 2016 was canceled at the very last minute by authorities. And to my surprise, that happened again, the exact same thing the following year, where this band had a concert scheduled and authorities canceled it at the very last minute. And this, if you want to understand why did this happen, I mean, the band has performed in Jordan many times before, has many fans, but ultimately my research suggests that it's because they don't self-censor. So they choose to explore topics that are controversial in the region, such as issues of religion and sexuality, and more even just than in their lyrics or their performances. As a public figure, their lead singer, Hamid Sino, photographed here when I saw them perform in Los Angeles in 2019, has for a long time openly identified as queer, and more recently, the violinist in the band, Papazian, has also done so, which unfortunately is considered controversial in the region as well. My chapter gives a detailed chronicle of the series of cancellations and at times violent backlash that this band has faced simply for trying to perform their music. The worst was in Egypt when, after they performed for some 35,000 fans, certain of those audience members were profiled to be queer or LGBTQI and were arrested and tortured in prison. And tragically, one of those fans has since died by suicide. And so these series of events that I chronicle could be reason enough to answer why Mashra Leila performs melancholy music, but I explore it further as well. So I chose this lens specifically after being struck by their final encore in their LA performance. And overall, this band's music is high energy dance music. It's not as though every one of their songs is slow and melancholy, but it struck me that this is how they chose to end. And I'll play you the opening lines of that song that I heard in Los Angeles. The title of it is Marikh, which means Mars. And the words that you'll hear in Arabic, the band has translated to cure me with a pill when I fall. And this is specifically a reference to Sino's openness about experiencing issues of mental illness. And he explained this when he introduced the song as well, that balance when you're trying to find the correct medication and maybe you haven't found the right one. So this is the opening to Marikh. And in the chapter, I argue that these performances of melancholy, as well as their broader refusal to self-censor, represents what philosopher Jacques Rancière calls dissensus, meaning simply when members of marginalized groups especially momentarily challenge the status quo. And I argue that the band performs melancholy to encourage their listeners to experience the suffering of others through music. And gratefully, I can add that their lead singer, Hamid Sino, read my chapter, reviewed it, approved of it, and to give you some of his own words in response, he said, Rancière was a significant influence when I was in college. And obviously enough, I was reading Mourning and Melancholia when I wrote Eudi after my father's passing. So here he's referencing Freud's seminal essay of Mourning and Melancholia from 1917 that I engage with in my analysis of melancholy in the chapter. And he also refers to it specifically in relation to the music video I analyzed there as well, Eudi, and that it was influencing him after his father's passing. So it was really all I could ask for, that it turns out that my analysis aligned with this expert in the scene. In my second chapter, you'll get more detail for this one soon, but in brief, I describe how two bands, 47 Soul and Ailul, perform decolonial joy through Debka. You can think of 47 Soul simply as an electronic music group, and Ailul, meaning September, as a rock band. But what sets these groups apart is that both feature Debka, which is a joyful Eastern Arab line dance and music tradition, in their performances and recordings. And when I say that they're decolonial, in part, I'm referring to how they express perseverance despite colonization. In the photograph here are two members of Ailul, Munif Suhul on the left and Ra'ad al-Tabari, and they're performing at Dar el-Saraya Museum in Irbid, a northern Jordanian city, for their first album launch on May 2nd in 2019. My third chapter focuses on El Farai, which means the branch, and this is one stage name for Tariq Abu Quaik, photographed here, and his solo rap and acoustic guitar act. When I say that he's Palestinian Jordanian, I'm referring to using local terminology for someone who is of Palestinian descent, but was born and raised in Jordan. And he's an incredibly talented musician who sings, raps, plays percussion and acoustic guitar. And he's managed to kind of get around an issue in Jordan where rap is really nowhere near as established as other genres in the country. A lot of venue owners are kind of hesitant to even invite rappers. Sometimes noise is an issue, but he kind of gets around this by most often performing rap while accompanying himself on the acoustic guitar there. And I would suggest that he demonstrates what I've mentioned earlier, that Jordan holds an outsized space in alternative Arabic music in the region, because he's just one artist, but he's known not only for his longtime solo work, but for co-founding two bands that are much loved and well known among those familiar with alternative Arabic music, El Murabba, meaning the square, and 47 Soul, which I discuss in detail in chapter 2. My third chapter argues specifically that Al-Fara'i represents the nuances of Palestinian indigeneity through ambiguous lyrics. My analysis here is based on current critical indigenous studies scholarship, and these scholars and Al-Fara'i's lyrics, I suggest, create an in-between space where they both critique legacies of colonization and highlight a fuller spectrum of indigenous expression that includes ambiguity. And so lots of artists, of course, write ambiguously, but I'm focusing here what that does specifically when it's expressed as an indigenous Palestinian. And I argue that he helps to unravel entrenched binaries that colonizers use against indigenous peoples. So the idea here is that colonization has been justified through creating hierarchies or binaries, us versus them type thinking, where colonizers imagine themselves to be superior, enlightened, bringing so-called culture to an indigenous people. And these kinds of limited understandings can linger. And so he's working to represent a more complex reality. And again, like I said, I always want to come back to the musicians' words themselves. So I was able to interview Al-Fara'i, luckily. And this is just one example of how he influenced my thinking to focus on ambiguity. So I was asking him in this context to explain the title of a song that I analyze in the chapter, Istishraq Dahili, which means internal Orientalism. And to explain the title, he said, quote, "It means we view ourselves from the eyes of the outside anyways, because there is no choice. Hey man, you can't keep dissing the Western culture because a lot of the things you already do and believe in, you've got from them and they're embedded." And then they feel like, well, but that's for everyone. And then my argument becomes, well, yes. And before Enlightenment in Europe, also some of the information coming from Arabic and Islamic cultures have been embedded, and it's normal. It's an anti-blame song. Let's stop blaming each other. And so for me, what struck me about this quote is that he's having this almost like hypothetical argument with someone about how the so-called East and so-called West are intertwined, and that it's not necessarily useful to try to understand them as so separate. And I think this represents a complex, ambiguous way of understanding the world. And I think that his work is ambiguous to encourage people to think. He wants people to complicate their understandings. And this doesn't mean that he doesn't critique the West, but overall, more broadly, I think he's encouraging complexity. I also wanted to explain that the first part of my title for this dissertation is a quote from one of his songs called Taht el-Ard, which means underground. And I asked him about this song as well, and he explained that an argument he had inspired the song. He was speaking with two music fans in Jordan who were politically disengaged as part of their music scene, which he referred to as, quote, underground music. And by that, he referred to US-based metal bands like Slipknot. And they wanted him to join their scene and to start disengaging from politics. And when he begins the song in Arabic, which the translation, "Don't Tell Me Underground," I think that he's saying, don't tell me to disengage from politics. But also what's really interesting about this is he begins the song saying, implying, don't tell me to disengage, don't tell me underground. But then by the chorus, you can see here the translation, the narrator is telling the listener, stay underground, which is the opposite, right? And this line here, "a volcano's flirting with you," I interpret to mean someone who's just on the edge of danger all the time. And it's almost as though the narrator here is beseeching the listener, stay safe, stay out of harm's way. And so that's just a simple example about how he purposely complicates things. And I offer this here as well so you can get a sense of the translation work in my dissertation. Throughout, you'll see Arabic characters on the right. You'll see the transliteration on the left, which is the Arabic characters represented in English letters in a system of that way. And then the English translation underneath. So this is a sample from Taht al-Ard. This is part of the chorus. In my conclusion, I focus in part on new directions for Amman's alternative scene. I spoke with a number of different musicians and scene contributors to get an update on what's been going on the past year. And I spoke to one member of a newer band, Irtidad. Again, they prefer ambiguity in their translation, but suggest that it could mean rebound or frequency, who are working on recording their first album. They're photographed here above. And I also spoke with Maïs Sahli, who is the co-owner of a key music venue in the capital called Corners, who started a whole online concert series during Jordan's strict COVID-19 lockdown and started the Jordanian Female Artist Collective, which is a huge accomplishment for such a male-dominated scene. We went from one professional women musician in Amman's alternative scene to Sahli starting a collective of upwards of 14 to 24 different female musicians. And I'll play you a selection from their debut performance, which was during the Amman Jazz Festival in 2021. It was a performance that mixed Arabic and English language covers. So this selection has them covering When the Saints Go Marching In. And Sahli added that what they've been working on is a series of music industry workshops that she organized for them, since there's a range of experience levels in the collective. And the next step would be to record an album so that each vocalist in the collective could have a track featuring them that they could use for their career going forward. So this is the collective. And now to go into more detail on my second chapter, where, to remind you, I discuss 47 Soul and Ailul, who perform decolonial joy through Debka in my interpretation. And if you're wondering what Debka looks like, I'll play you a video clip here of Debka being performed by the Jordanian dance troupe El Ajaweed, which roughly translates to the generous ones, dancing Debka. And I show you this troupe specifically because 47 Soul features them in the music video that I'll discuss a little bit next. And they uploaded this video of the troupe on their Instagram page, 47 Soul. So here's Debka. And for a little more background on 47 Soul and Ailul, both founded in Jordan in 2013, and 47 Soul founded around the shared Palestinian ancestry of its members and has now toured globally. Whereas Ailul, notably founded in Irbid, this northern Jordanian city I mentioned, and emphasizes some members' roots in the Hauran Plain, which one band member explained to me is now divided between northern Jordan, southern Syria, the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights. And Ailul has members as well of Palestinian, Jordanian, and Syrian ancestry. What role does joy play? In the chapter, I explore how joy can strengthen activism, and I specifically define joy following Mashra Leila's lead singer, Hamid Sino, again with this method of trying to follow the lead of experts, local experts in alternative Arabic music in my own analysis. And so in an interview, Sino cites the authors and activists Montgomery and Bergman, who define joy not as individual happiness. In that case, they're in dialogue with the feminist theorist Sarah Ahmed. Instead, they define joy as a social quality of openness to affect one another in the context of activist groups who are working to strengthen their own activist community. And I add that context is important here because, of course, I'm not suggesting that this is a universal definition of joy, that there is no other, or even that everyone would experience their music as joyful. Instead, what I'm suggesting is that this is a definition of joy that a really well-respected member of alternative Arabic music is currently using in his own yet-to-be-released work with his band Mashra Leila. So I know that it's relevant to those who are experts in this scene. It also relates to these two bands, 47 Soul and Ailul, strongly because it's very clear when you listen to their music and their statements that they have political positions that they are trying to strengthen in activist communities. It also works with Debka because this dance is a symbol of joy. For Eastern Arabs, one Palestinian scholar, Shomali, writes, quote, Debka is a symbol of cooperation and solidarity and a symbol of joy, strength, steadfastness, and determination, end quote. And basically, it has a deep cultural associations with celebrations. If you grew up in one of these Eastern Arab cultures, you would immediately associate Debka with, let's say, weddings, perhaps the birth of a baby, parties. Debka would be a part of it. And participating in this social dance requires some degree of openness to affect one another. And again, to come back to the words of experts in alternative Arabic music, this is from Wallace Abate, member of 47 Soul and a talented Debka dancer on joy. He said, quote, it can say a different thing about us, Palestinians, as people from our region, that people abroad can share the same way, that we celebrate and enjoy life. This is the context of it. We are not just a people who cry and suffer. We are a people who create and enjoy. And this was quoted by indigenous Palestinian anthropologist Nadim Karkabi, who is one of the few to have published an article on 47 Soul. Debka also represents what I call here decolonial politics. In one sense, this means that it resists colonial misrepresentations of Arabs as violent actors or victims. It also expresses perseverance despite British, French, and Israeli colonization. I also draw from Karkabi here again to explain how it could foster political solidarity through what he calls the shared experience of joy. And I'm engaged with current indigenous media theorist Freya Shiwi as well, who argues that joy can enact prefigurative politics, meaning that it can enact a united or anti-hierarchical future that a group seeks now. And to give you a quote that I also include in my chapter that for me really highlights the politics of Debka, this is from ethnomusicologist David MacDonald's book on Palestinian music and politics, where he quotes the Palestinian librarian, scholar, and folklorist Abdelaziz Abu Hudba, who says, quote, "They have stolen our land," and then he stomps his foot, as you would in Debka, "forces us out of our homes. But our culture is something they cannot steal. When we stamp our feet, we are saying that no matter how far we have been scattered, Palestine will always remain under our stamping feet." For me, this quote really highlights how Debka is inherently political for Palestinians, meaning, whether it's explicitly said or not, it asserts that despite all that Palestinians have lost at Israeli hands, it's as if the stomp of the foot is a physical expression of their presence on the land, that they're still there and still celebrating their culture. To get into some specific examples from my chapter, one song I talk about is by Ailul. It's called Nazil al-Ghor, which means heading down to the Jordan Valley. And with this example, I'll focus on sounds, and with the next one, I'll focus more on images. Here, they're sonically drawing on the joy of Debka heritage. And I know, thanks to Jordanian musicologist Hani El-Khatib, that Nazil al-Ghor is based on a Debka song known to Jordanian farmers. And it skillfully blends both rock instruments like electric guitar and drum set and Debka instruments. When they perform live, that would be the mijwiz, which is photographed above here with equal length reed pipes. And in the audio version, they use the argul, photographed below, with the unequal reed pipes. I'll play you two selections from the song so that you can hear how they blend these different instrumentations so well. This will be at the beginning, and you can listen for electric guitar and drum set specifically. And the lyrics that you'll hear, just a translation by the band, is "Brother who is going to Al-Ghor, lucky you." And in this selection of the same song, you can listen for the argul, which evokes Debka sonically for those familiar with this tradition. And when Ailul performs this song live, this is a cue for, like I said, for those familiar with the tradition to get up and dance Debka, along with a number of the band members who come off stage and join in the dancing. For more on the song and the band's decolonial politics, lyrically in Nazil al-Ghor, they critique Israeli seizures of the Golan Heights, they celebrate the rich farmland of the Jordan Valley, and they also reference the 1968 Battle of Karameh, which Palestinians and Jordanians view as a victory over Israel, in that it prevented Israeli occupation of the Jordan Valley. And this, I know, thanks to UCSB comparative literature PhD candidate Jordanian Ghassan Abu Rokayek. But more broadly as well, Ailul can be understood as enacting decolonial politics in that, for one, they're working to decenter the capital Amman in terms of the music scene. So otherwise, the capital is, undeniably the center of the music I study. But they specifically chose to have their first album launch be in their home city, the northern city of Irbid, and in the event description use this kind of wording that we're working to decenter the music scene so that other cities are better represented, other areas. And as well, their celebration of their identification of some members with the Hauran Plain, a whole geographic region that I was unfamiliar with until I spoke to members of Ailul. who, highlight how this region has now been divided among all of these different countries, beginning after World War I with British and French empires drawing up map boundaries. Yet they're asserting this is here, we identify with this is who we are. And to turn to images of Debka in the music video by 47 Soul called Border Control, and photographed here with his hands in the air is Willis Bate, the musician I mentioned who was briefly arrested. And I argue that this music video demonstrates how the band works to foster political solidarity broadly through joy around issues, in this case, of border walls and crossing restrictions. And I give you a list here of the broad scope with which they're trying to reach and make connections with people. The music video is shot in 4 different locations: in Jordan, Mexico, Palestine, and the UK. It features 3 languages for the first time for the band. Arabic and English is normal for them in almost every song, but they add Spanish as well, thanks to featuring the rapper Fedzilla, based in the UK, who is German-Chilean, as well as Shadia Mansour, a veteran of Arabic hip hop, who's Palestinian British. And this is also the first time that the band has featured female identifying musicians. And so these are all different ways that they can make broader connections. Maybe one of their listeners never felt as connected to the band if they weren't, male identifying specifically, but then when they see these strong women in their music, maybe it's a way that they connect to them at a whole different level. And that same kind of process could happen maybe for someone who suddenly hears Spanish in their context or suddenly sees one of these different locations they're familiar with. I'll play you a brief selection from their music video and ask you to notice who's dancing. And the reason I ask you that is because the suggestion here is that there's a possibility through dancing with others to create a political solidarity or a connection that wasn't there before through this social dance. So you'll see them with the Debka dance troupe, El Ejaweed, introduced earlier, also with dancing with strangers on the street, and with rapper Fedzilla as well, with the idea that joy is a way to potentially foster solidarity and strengthen activism. In summary, my dissertation helps fill this major music scholarship gap on Jordan. It works to demonstrate Jordan's outsized place in the region's alternative Arabic music. It bridges academic fields by connecting specific case studies from the Middle East and North Africa to current feminist studies and critical indigenous studies. And it works to counter misrepresentations of Arabs, especially by centering their voices. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing any questions or comments you might have now or at another time.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.